Everybody. Is this the podium mic is on? Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be here talking to you all. I just moved from the US to Japan in June, actually. So I'm relatively new to living in Japan. And if you wanted to hear about the experience of moving here, all the glory and the issues that come up, I'm happy to chat offline about that. But generally, it's a wonderful transition. So one of the things I've been very interested in is understanding knowledge in particular. And knowledge comes in lots of forms. And, personally, I've focused more on individual knowledge than social knowledge, although I have done some work on that as well. Um, and one of the tools that's really been very useful for investigating this is one that comes up a lot in studying social dynamics and the reasons that we might be as people, somewhat special, right? So I actually ended up asking ChatGPT for an image, right? Because trying to add images, because I make very text-heavy presentations. Please create a real-looking image that provides examples of how humans are superior to other animals on Earth, right? It's this sort of the old argument about how we've taken over the entire globe in a very short period of time and have although there's lots of technological developments that do happen with animals and with even microorganisms and epigenetics and things like that. It's far less, to the extent as, at least from our perspective, of how extensive human technological advances have been, right? Instantaneous communication across the world, the ability to ask ChatGPT to produce an image of how humans are superior to other animals on Earth, and you get mostly pictures of animals, this dolphin jumping in out of a pond in front of an elephant, which was fun for me. But like most things, if you improve your prompt here and ask again, you get a slightly better image, right? But at any rate, right, people have been interested in what are the mechanisms and how do we study these different mechanisms by which we can try to understand what makes people different from these other animals, even if those other animals have some amount of cumulative development of technology and things like that. And it turns out that the similar tools that people have been using, and I'll talk about those tools and the formal bases for what they do, um, uh, uh, can also be used to study individual level knowledge too. And so it turns out formally it's the same sort of process, and one that from a I always like to go, psychology did this first whenever I can, because, psychologists don't have a lot of claims to fame with these sorts of things. But when it comes to serial reproduction and studying cumulative effects of agents acting on, and the environment, and then reacting on the environment and reacting on the environment, and looking at the cumulative effects of such a procedure, one of the oldest sort of techniques for doing this comes back to sort of Peter Bartlett and his studies of serial reproduction. So in these types of studies, right, a participant will see a stimulus, right? So in this particular one, my cats made me use this example as opposed to a different one, just because they really like this one. So the participants see a stimulus. It might be something like an owl. There's a short delay, and then they have to reproduce that stimulus, right? And what this is showing is one particular set of participants who were shown then the prior participants drawing, not the original one, right? So after that memory delay, and what you can see is over time, this is, the owl kind of, although it's a weird owl to begin with, I will say, it ends up regularizing to cats, right? And this is this general idea that, this there's no, there's nothing that is being given by the experimenter outside of what the participant is producing. So this must be some bias, right? We have a bias towards regularizing to more typical animals or to cats, right? And, another sort of paradigm where this comes up that's more socially relevant is in trying to understand language. So this is a paradigm that's used a lot, and there's a number of different studies, and I just picked one of them to exemplify it. Iterated learning of language, right? So researchers will make these artificial new languages and see how they develop over time when learners are trying to use it, and learners end up shaping that language, and then that shaped language gets transmitted to the next learner. So this is a particular study from Kirby and Smith, and in that study, there was 3 shapes, 3 colors by 3 motions, right? So you had these circles, triangles. I think I'm just showing the circles and triangles. I think there was a square as well. You ended up having blue, black, and another color, and then the motion of it on the screen, and participants were given a label for each of them, right? And they learned a subset of them, and then they reproduced that subset after a delay, and then the reproduced subset was what was given to the next participants. And that procedure repeated itself over and over and over again. And what they found was that over time, and this is a common finding across lots of different studies like this, is that even though there was no structure in the language that was created at the beginning, structure emerged, right? And so that structure emerging must be some sort of property of some bias that the learners have, right? And so people use this then to argue about the types of regularities that are biases for learners. But one of the things we'll see is that the mathematical formalism, does prove that, these types of processes will end up converging to the biases of the learners, but that doesn't give you cumulative development, like it was sort of sold at the beginning, right? It keeps you at whatever the prior biases of your population of your agents are, right? So it doesn't give you something new, right? It only gives you what was there to begin with in the agents, right? So this idea of this process being used to explain cumulative development still has a lot of unanswered questions, right? And there's active research, and I'll talk about some of those at the end of the day after giving some examples about this. Okay, so that sort of makes us want to understand, well, what are the theoretical bases for these? How do these processes work? I found these experiments to be really fun as well, so it's like nice to go through them as well. I'll give you sort of how psychology methodology, even in the last 2 decades, has developed, an unpublished study of mine that then was done more properly by one of my colleagues, a decade later, and with a lot more sophistication due to among a number of things, but the differences in technological advances since then. Okay, so in this talk I'm going to do a little bit more math than the other speakers, just to get people to understand a little bit of what is happening and hopefully an intuition and of how it is that these processes work, because they're actually a class of algorithms that are used in machine learning to end up estimating distributions of interest. So implicit knowledge being one of those, social biases could be another one of these distributions of interest, right? And we're hijacking the machine learning tools, so to speak, right, to end up allow us to elicit these kinds of distributions in implicit ways from people, right, to get at these biases. And so that's sort of the transition there. I'll give some examples of this from my personal experience, and then move to some other kinds of examples that get more from the individual to global knowledge, and then show some examples of how this is being studied today to understand, well, what else must be needed to get beyond the biases of personal information? Is it something like technological understanding or causal reasoning or something like that, and how researchers get at that? But really, there's still more questions than there are answers, I think, and it's a really ripe field for doing really interesting work in. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with Markov, this was Markov over here, and he's the namesake for Markov chains. And the way that it's normally taught, is that given the present, the future is independent of the past, right? So if I know the state of right now, knowing the history doesn't tell me anything more about what the future of the world is, right? If I know every single atom, every single position, every string's vibration level, I can then use physics to predict exactly what's going to happen in the future. Knowing the prior string vibration levels doesn't tell me anything, right? Is at least what the physicists would tell you. So we have Markov of the past, right, compared to Markov of the really past, right? If I'm trying to predict what's going to happen to our dear old Markov nearing the later stages of his life, right, all I need to know is the middle form of it, right? Knowing more than that about what happened prior to that doesn't help me. And this seems like a reasonable assumption in some ways, right? And it actually buys you a lot mathematically, right? So this kind of idea that all I need to do is condition on a prior time step and I can involve all the dynamics of my, successively updating kind of random variable, right, actually allows you to prove that these under somewhat mild restrictions, right, and assumptions that you will converge to a stationary distribution. And that sounds, kind of confusing. So to make this more clear, right, I don't know, raise your hand if you've shuffled a deck of cards before. So why do you shuffle cards, right? Why do we shuffle cards? I brought a prop today. It's stopped by the convenience and bought a Nintendo deck of cards, actually. Uh, so we shuffle cards to get a random order, right? So when I stop shuffling, right, I have no idea of what the order is of the deck of cards, right? So I'm looking from one ordering of the deck of cards. I make an operation, a random change to my deck of cards, right, to the order of the deck. I don't know exactly what that does, but what I'm doing is I'm making it so that over time, it gets closer and closer to every single time I do a shuffle. I'm keeping this distribution in the card order over the, uniform over the order of the deck of cards, right? And that way we can play fairly with one another. That's usually not specified as a kid. You just felt an intuition that this should converge to being random over the orderings of decks of cards. And, I'll teach you a little bit more about card shuffles in a bit. But that's what it means to converge to a stationary distribution. The stationary distribution of the shuffling operation is the, being uniform over the orderings of the cards of the deck. To give a little bit, I like coin flip sequences and thinking about that because it makes things very clear and concrete, and there's still a lot of richness to it. But just to give you sort of, another way of thinking about this, let's say I have this kind of process that, I start at either heads or tails, and this is capturing, what might be a sticky coin, right? So the coin, maybe I have two coins, one that produces mostly heads, right? One that produces mostly tails, and then I randomly switch between the two, right? And the way that mathematically that we would look at that, right, is we would write that as a matrix. And when I'm at the heads, I can think of this as a machine that's moving between these different states, or I can think of it from the perspective of a matrix, right? And if my current state is heads, right, and then I, will sample a uniform distribution from 0 to 1, right, to see if it's less than 0.9, then I would stay at that state. And if it's greater than 0.9, then I would change to another state, right? So here I sampled, okay, I'm still heads, right? And that's one step of this process. This is a Markov chain, a very simple one, but just to give an example of what these things look like formally. And, eventually I would get something that's different, right, with probability 1. And so, right, eventually I got something greater than 0.9. And so I switched and now I have a tails instead, right? And if you generate a whole lot of sequences from this kind of process, you start looking at things like this, right? And I think that intuitively would have been something you would have thought of. You get a lot of heads and then a lot of tails and then a lot of heads and then a lot of tails, right? Those kinds of types of distributions. Now, if I asked you, well, in the long run, is there going to be more heads than tails? You'd probably say, well, it seems even, right? It should be even, right? Well, why? Because it's sort of balanced. You could make arguments about that. But one neat trick that you can do with Markov chains and things like this, and this is a neat trick that made a lot of money for people, actually. So this is the basis for PageRank. That was what made Google search better than other search algorithms at the time, was to figure out, okay, what's the stationary distribution of randomly searching on the internet? Because if you're just randomly searching on the internet, certain sites would probably be more likely to be at, right? Just if you click on different links, right? Like at the time, Alta Vista, GeoCities, right, would be very popular, whereas other ones would be less popular, right? And if you do that process, what you're actually doing is you're multiplying your transition matrix, and you can check this on your for homework if you want to. You're multiplying it over and over and over again because you're applying the dynamics of this process and multiplying it over and over again. And it's a really simple way then to get to what the stationary distribution of these processes are, right? It's called the power method for finding the first eigenvector, right, of this transition matrix. But and you can prove all sorts of things about what these things look like and how quick the convergence will be and all sorts of things like that, right? So this is the underlying math that's actually equivalent to how we end up doing these serial reproduction tests, right? What they're doing is they're getting at the particular target distribution that you have in mind by doing this repetitive process, and you actually converge pretty quickly in a lot of cases, although not always, to whatever that bias is. Okay, so I've already hinted at what Markov Chain Monte Carlo is, so that's what this is called, this kind of process. So when you have a target distribution, let's say P of X of some sort, right? You could design, but I don't know how to sample from it, right? If you told me to create, just give me a random order from the deck of cards, I would probably just throw the cards on the floor, right? I don't know how to do that, right? So that's why we created, different technologies, so to speak, in terms of how we change the deck of cards, right, successively, one after another, to get at a stationary distribution. And so Markov Chain Monte Carlo is a general set of techniques for developing a Markov chain whose whose stationary distribution is whatever distribution you have in mind. Okay. So, like I said, you may be more familiar with things like riffle shuffles, right? So, you go like this, right? And you put the cards together and you go like that, right? So this seems like a better kind of, I just want to show off the bridge, right? That I can do a bridge. That's part of the goal of this. But, there's other kinds of ways of shuffling a card. So you could shuffle like this, right? You can shuffle in other different ways. And now you might have an intuition for, well, all of them actually will converge to this random order over the set of cards, right? So an even simpler one, which is just take a random card and move it to the top, will do it as well, right? So I can just, every turn, just pick a random card and move it to the top of my deck. It's going to take a really long time, right? So I think it's like 52 log 52 number of steps it's the expected number of steps until you hit the stationary distribution. And when you're in a stationary distribution, that's a whole nother, you get other problems by using these types of methodologies, but we'll get there. The riffle shuffle, which is the one that, with the bridge and all that, actually takes 7 on average. And casinos at the time when that mathematical analysis, we're only doing 5 for blackjack, actually. And so they changed it, and then it turned out actually that the analysis didn't originally take into account that suits don't matter. They treated each card as special in 52. So when you have the suits not mattering, it turns out that 5 is actually the correct number, which I think is kind of interesting because when you talk about people's perceptions of randomness, we usually focus on all the bad cases of that. But actually, we have some strong intuitions, especially when money gets involved sometimes. Not always, though. So at any rate, before I ramble more about casinos and pachinko and all that, move random cards to the top, and this will end up converging. And there's different rates of convergence depending on the types of techniques you use. Okay. So it turns out both of these schemes are actually the same, but people talk about them differently. But Metropolis Hastings is one that is sort of the basis for what other ones are built off of. So the way that this works is you sort of initialize the value, right, of the states of the chain. So usually this is just uniformly at random, right? You just pick some random values, right? So the cards come in some random order when I start, right? Then I propose a next state, right? So what it means by symmetrically is if I like shuffle like this, right, then getting it from this starting point, I'm just as likely to get back that way. It turns out you can weaken that assumption and it's okay, but it takes a little bit more effort. And then I decide to accept this new state with probability as the next state of my chain, proportional to the relative likelihoods, right? So, sorry, that's didn't say that as clearly as I could. So if the new state has more likely under the distribution I'm looking for, then I automatically go to it. It's great. But if it's less likely, depending on how less likely it is, I'm still going to take some chance of going there because otherwise I'll have this greedy search and I'll never actually explore outside of my the current range that I'm in. So to give you some clarity of this, I have a couple of visualizations to try to make this more clear. So let's say I started here, right? And then my proposal distribution, when I'm talking about, a one-dimensional continuous thing, will be something like a Gaussian bump quite often, right? And then I would just draw a new random variable value, from that. So it might be something like move to the left a little bit, right? It turns out that for the distribution of interest, that's a lot less, right? So it's how much less? It's about half the less. And then I draw a random, uniform, do a coin flip to whether to accept it or not. I reject it, right? So I stay at this current state. So my next state starts again. I happen to draw one to the right. That's more, that's a better example under the sort of distribution of interest that I have. And so I go there with probability 1. And I can just repeat this ad infinitum. And so Qifeng has this really nice demo for this. And I'll probably play this twice. I'm not going to go to full screen because that sometimes causes issues for Zoom. But what you can see right now is that the process is looking at, so let me, before it starts to change it. So at the beginning, right, this proposal has a very small, it's just moving a little bit. That's every time what it's doing is it's proposing a new example. And when it's green, it's accepting that proposal. And when it's red, it's rejecting it. And you can see that it doesn't move outside of that initial mode that it starts in, right? If you only have it proposing things that are a little bit, and then you have a ring around that's really bad, right? Under your current distribution, you never move away from it. And so a couple things I just wanted to point out about that, right, is that you can see that it's taking most of those states. It's usually moving to the next state, though, when it has a smaller proposal, right? When the proposal variance grows a lot, it actually ends up rejecting a lot more of the examples, and so you get a lot less diversity in the set. So this is one of the reasons why, among others, that Metropolis Hastings ends up, not always being used if you can avoid it, because it sometimes takes a long time to converge to the true distribution that you're interested in, because you end up spending all this time rejecting samples if you need to get at it. You can see that this barely even explored after 1,000 different steps of doing this. One of the best parts of the space, right, for doing this. Okay, so that was sort of what Metropolis Hastings looked like. Gibbs sampling is a bit more straightforward. You start with a chain in a set of states, and then you pick a random variable, and you sample that value conditioned on all the others. And most of the examples of studies that I'm going to talk through now, so we're almost done with the math. Congratulations, you did it. You made it. But it was a little bit more math just to show exactly what we're converging to when we're dealing with people. Making samples and what kinds of assumptions we need to make and when that could be. I should sort of say agents, not people. My apologies. I'm human. I'm a human ego-centric person and don't always deal with non-human agents, but I'm trying to be more inclusive as well. Okay, so the introduction to Markov Chain Monte Carlo with people, right? So in this case, like the iterated learning language example, right? You have data that people see, they're getting some hypotheses, storing it in their memory, then they're reproducing that data, and then that goes to the next person, right? And then this process repeats over and over again. And so if we want to understand what the consequences are, right, we need to start to formalize this of learners learning from other learners, right, in this kind of way. And what, would be if people were Bayesian agents, right? What that would mean is that they are, taking conditioned on their data, then they're forming a hypothesis and forming a posterior distribution over the hypotheses as to what could have created that data, right? And then based on those hypotheses, they generate the next set of data for the next participants, right? And this process repeats over and over again. I'm using the fake picture of Bayes that is a painting of Bayes that I think is not actually a paint. I can't keep track of whether this is a real image of Bayes or not. I remember there was a lot of drama on the internet about this at one point. This has become to be associated with Reverend Bayes, regardless of whether it actually is him or not. And what you can see is over time, this ends up, this process just repeats. And if I make this assumption that it's coming from the posterior, I'll weaken it a little bit. It actually doesn't depend on that strong of an assumption. And the likelihood is what's producing the data, though we can actually analyze this really quite well, right? And so what that ends up looking at is it'll end up converging to the prior distribution. And I can show you that in a second, either on the hypotheses or the data. That's what this Markov chain will converge to. I wanted to, though, be clear that actually, this will fit with the assumptions can be weakened to any Barker acceptance rule or loose exponentiated loose choice rule. So essentially, the softmax on the true utilities, right, fits this particular one. There's a complication that you need to, if you want the exact values and not just the orderings, you need to know what the temperature is, right, to work that back. But you can at least get order regardless. Apologies if that was too much details, but that sometimes is lost with when people are talking about this. And that's an important distinction, especially for folks here who do reinforcement learning type work with social situations, because you're usually making that assumption, right? That you're maybe not always working with respect to your utilities, but you're working with some sort of exponentiated, temperature version of that. Okay. So if I work on this process, the proof is actually pretty simple for this of, what this ends up looking like is that if I do this over and over again, right, I can end up showing that, oh, I didn't actually show the proof. That's right, because I was smart not to show the proof. But at any rate, what you can end up basically showing is that that particular P of D given H, P of H given D, if I marginalize over D, that actually is P of H. And so now I'm sampling successfully. My transition function is going from the priors H, and so I end up converging to that in the limit. And then I can do something similar for the predictive distribution. So often we don't have access and we can't ask people, okay, sample, give me your knowledge, right? You can't just ask people for knowledge, right? Usually we're getting a proxy of that, which is the data that we suspect are generating that knowledge, right? And so that converges then to the prior expectations we have over data if we do this process repeatedly. And there's a whole lot of interesting work about, well, what if you mix in environmental information, then you get a different kind of convergence, although if the environmental information is weak, actually the proofs on that are, I think, still need to be developed more in the theory there. So people who are interested in theory, there's a lot of really interesting directions there. Okay, so let's actually look at some of these examples and now work through. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the math. We did it. I'm feeling okay. I hope you all are feeling okay too. Math can be scary, and I just get scared by math myself as well, even though I do math all the time. So I'm open about my math fear and happy to chat about that. Okay, so this was actually an experiment I was in. It was one of the early examples of Metropolis Hastings and its Markov Chain Monte Carlo with people. This was in Narip's talk in 2007, actually. And I was a participant because I was an undergrad RA at Brown working with Tom and Adam Sanborn. The way that the study worked, for 1 hour, I judged a whole lot of stick figures that were all giraffes. And I had to say which one of these two things was more like a giraffe, right? It was a very long, slow study. And then there was many chains doing this at once, and it converged to what I thought of this stick figure space giraffe-like looking things did. I did this another hour for cats, another hour for dogs, and another hour for horses, right? So these were sort of, from the study, sort of the prototypical stick animals. And one thing I want to point out that you can already see cultural effects here, right? Like students that are undergraduates at Brown, which is where this was originally done, right? They're dogs, right? It's not, Japanese dogs aren't so big usually, right? They're usually tinier. So I think if this was run in Japan, it would have been shorter dogs. Is it worth doing that study in Japan? Probably not. I'm not sure how important, understanding people's stick figure understanding of dogs and the cross-cultural. But the reason why I mention that is we'll see later that you can do cross-cultural versions and see different convergences, right, from different cultures and get at different cultural things. And this is just showing the overall space projected into PCA. There were 9 dimensions that actually were changing. And you can see that you do get like tinier, I mean, dogs, you do start to get like these kinds of like horse dogs is a little bit weird. Anyway, it gets kind of weird when you're at the boundaries, but that's one set. And that gets at my implicit knowledge and other people's implicit knowledge of what these different animals should look like, right? Don't ask me to draw anything. I'm really bad at drawing. And so I couldn't even draw stick figures that look that good, probably, right? Um, Another sort of domain that this has been applied in is trying to understand people's subjective experiences of regularity as opposed to randomness, right? But let's say I'm saying that something is, I'm right now projecting, I saw 5 coin flip sequences, right? I'm projecting through ESP into all of your minds the random coin flip sequence that I saw. So which one of these is the random coin flip sequence that I saw, right? Using my ESP projection. So is it the first one you think? Is that the one? Now go with your ESP, don't just go with your gut, right? This is the ESP I'm telling you in my mind, I'm projecting it out, right? Or is it the second one? Yeah, some people get the second ones too, right? More people raised their hand for the first one, right? It turns out this was an actual experiment that was done in the 1930s in the US by the Zenith radio company. And, as you may be, if you're dissecting by experimental method there, right? Yeah, there's a confound here, right? Like which one of these feels like it's more random, right? Is what actually is being judged. But it's a nice set of data that you can actually show, people as, and get a proxy. And a lot of people sent in data then to the Zenith company, and they analyzed it to look at what things people perceive as random. Remember that a coin flip sequence, all of them are equal, right? So in theory, they should all be the same, but we have these strong intuitions as to what is random, right? Okay, I lied. There's a little bit more math. I'm sorry. So, what's a random or a regular generating process, right? Well, what you should be doing if you're trying to do this correctly, right? So there's a lot of theories for how this might work, is that you should be looking at, okay, does it provide more information for it having been generated by a random process or a regular process, right? I'm assuming the priors are equal when I do that. And uh, it's really easy to know what the random distribution should be, right? It's 2 to the negative length of a coin flip sequence, right? But what is the distribution over regularities of binary sequences that people have? I don't know. And actually, there's a lot of papers arguing different things. If you care about that, please talk to me about it. I love this kind of ideas. It gets into all sorts of interesting, fun things like algorithmic complexity and things like that if you're interested in that. But regardless, right, this is actually a really nice example of where we can do Gibbs sampling with people, right? So in this example, we're interested in the probability of X given regular. And we can't just ask participants to create binary sequences that are not random. I mean, you can, but it's weird, right, as a thing to do. But it's a lot more intuitive to sort of say, okay, I'm seeing a sequence of coins, right? I'm filling in one of those coins that was generated by a random process, right? Or sorry, a process that was not random. That is key here. And so our outcome has been hidden by a box. What do you think is underneath, right? And then we fed what participants were doing. There was 40 different initializations, and then we fed whatever they were doing to themselves, actually. So this is a within subjects version of Markov Chain Monte Carlo with Gibbs sampling, right? Because I'm changing the state of one of the variables at each time. 40 chains initialized randomly, and participants replaced every element at least twice. And what you find is that 15% of the mass is the first 2 columns here. So those are 8 heads, 8 tails, right? And then you can get actually the distributions of regularity then, right? And this is sort of going from most regular to least regular for all the 256 coin flip sequences that are 2 to the 8. Now, yes, we could have just enumerated them all with 256, but if you had 16 coin flips or so on, we can do even more. Another thing I wanted to highlight here, for those of you who are early career researchers, you might get really stressed out, if you haven't published your work yet and get pressure in 3 years, right? Like, let's say. So this was a project that is a series of studies that Tom Griffith started with his PhD advisor, Josh Tenenbaum, in like 2002. And then I worked on it a little bit with Tom when I was a grad student, and then as a professor, I was still interested in this question, and I had an undergrad working with me at Brown, Dylan Daniels, who then, so we had 4 levels of academics, generation here in this one paper. And it took 18 years, I think, from when Tom first started working on the project, I asked him, to when it finally was published. I don't recommend taking 18 years. It's bad for your career. But, even the, illustrious Tom Griffiths, who's an amazing, kind, sweet, brilliant, extremely productive researcher, um, you know, sometimes takes 18 years to publish his work. So, it made me feel a little better, at least, about me taking 5 or 6 years sometimes to publish my work, because I'm a little bit slow at publication. Okay, so that's within subjects. Let me just check the time briefly. Okay, I'm gonna go, I'm fine on time. I'm going to just briefly describe my version of doing this between subjects with humans, and then show you sort of a more rich version of this that was done later on by Nori Jacobs, and thank him, and also Bill Thompson for some, although I didn't end up using a lot of their slides, but was very helpful. They provided some material for this. But at any rate, you can end up initializing random notes, right, for 8 quarter note sequences of songs. Not the most exciting songs on earth, but these are songs like bum 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 bum, right, things like that. And then what you can do is then for each note, pick a new value given other note values, save the state at the end of that procedure, and sample expectations. Just keep on repeating this over and over again. Right, so in case this process hasn't become clear to you yet, right, here's the very beginning with the initialization. You end up muting one of the notes, and then you have participants fill in that muted note. Right, that's how we did that for this particular thing. And then it's slightly different than actually the previous versions that were done, or sorry, the later versions. So we're just filling in one note at a time, and doing this over and over again, right? And this is then given to subsequent participants. And this just keeps on proceeding ad infinite, as long as possible. And I think, usually we do make sure everything gets replaced about 2 or 3 times. And convergence to stationary distributions, I'll talk briefly at the end about the complexities of knowing that. And so this method is very cool and a lot of fun, and you can get at things that are a lot harder to get at by testing things directly, but it does have its flaws and downsides as well. So I just also wanted to show you, this was actually the interface that I developed, and I developed it in Flash. Unpopular opinion was that Flash ActionScript was actually my favorite web experiment development tool. But at the time, I had, I made a little keyboard in the GUI, and connected to MIDI sounds that were downloaded, and lots of waves for each of the single notes, right? And then participants would hear the original one, they could place it, and I had to do all the management of chains because you had participants all performing this task asynchronously. So I had different chains across the different participants. I could only allow 10 participants to do it at once because that was how many chains were there, and it got a busy signal otherwise. And then I did, I actually wrote locking code for the chains data. I didn't use an SQL database at the time, and wrote custom PHP for it all. It worked great. It was not an issue. However, I don't recommend doing things that way anymore, and I'll show you there's some really much nicer tools now. But you still could get, let's see if this plays. Too bad. That's okay. I basically sang it to you what it would sound like, and over time it went from things like do 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 do, right? Like this is more just uniformly random, to things that were like do 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 do, right? So you start to get some of sort of the classic Western expectations. This was run in person at Berkeley, I believe. Actually, we did this. No, this was online through Amazon Mechanical Turk already. Sorry, thinking back to 15 years ago. So my memory sometimes bleeds together. And we could show that actually the empirical range and intervals matched human expectations. And recent work has vastly done this a lot more interestingly and much better. But just wanted to also, I get to publish my unpublished work from 2010 on this as well, with this, not really publishing, but talking to you all about it. So thank you. And so now, rather than needing to write your own custom PHP code with, you can actually use these really wonderful techniques that and tools that people have been developing for a good number of years now. Nori Jacobi shared this particular slides and a few others. And has been a leader, I think, lately in doing these types of experiments online and developing tools that are usable for others. With Markov Chain Monte Carlo with people, he sort of demonstrated how you can then link people together in interesting ways, and use that with sort of whatever kinds of web frameworks you're trying to use. He is, I guess Heroku is with Python usually, but I think you can use other ones as well, right? As long as you can put it in Docker. Anyway, so one study that he did, it's a similar kind of study to this, but he actually had people singing, right? I didn't have the ability to record from people's mics at the time. He also had people singing 3 notes, and there's 3,000 different melodies across the 2,000 participants, and he had people in US and India do this, right? And if you're unfamiliar with Indian music, it has a very different set of tones. So you only did 3 tones, but the intervals between the tones there's the Western kind of major thirds, right? Everything needs to be major, minor thirds, and perfect fourths and things like that, right? The fifth is a much more popular note, and also the directionality going up and down is more common in Indian music than it is in US style music. You get a lot of vibrato in it. And what they ended up showing was that, across all this, you have these kinds of some set of like converged common expectations, right? And this is sort of the US style one where, you get some of these kinds of just going up and down and, in different ways. And if you look at the, he actually, yeah, I can't get the music, that's fine. And if you look at the difference between India and the US, right, you see that the India culture doesn't have as commonly, right, it's still there. People are producing a lot less that just going up, right, kind of pattern, at least for 3-note sequences. So you can start to get at differences between cultures, right? I think it'd be, interesting to look at Middle Eastern cultures, especially, right? They have very different kinds of cross-cultural expectations. And I think this has been run across the world at this point. Okay. So just spend the last time that I have here to discuss, coming back to, now that we've gone through and talked about a lot of different Markov chain Monte Carlo with people studies and what has been done, how does this apply to technological development and cumulative technological change? And, theoretical analyses, suggest that Markov chain Monte Carlo with people, like I showed you, converges to the prior biases of agents, in which case there shouldn't be any accumulation of knowledge. That's still a sort of a true theoretical result. And so the question then becomes, right, what aspects of that you can introduce then? So how researchers, I think, have used this result nicely, whether explicitly or implicitly, is trying to tease apart what other kinds of information can I include other than just the thing I'm working on, and see how that affects whether progress is made, right? And people's understandings and things like that, right? So one really beautiful example, and thank you, Bill Thompson, for the slides based on this, right, is the task was kind of, and analyses were really interesting, but quite detailed. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of it. What participants were doing was they were learning how to do like classic sorting, right? Like from computer science, you learn how to sort particular examples as fast as possible, right? And he had a task like that. And they either got to just see how the strategies previous people did, right? And they also got to give a little bit of an explanation of their strategy. And you got to see a few of those, right, just randomly, or you can see it and select who you want to see from based on their performances, right? And if you look at the task performance of the people who get to look at who's doing better in a task, right, you see that actually those, right, this kind of selective social learning actually makes a really big difference, right? You're not just picking at random who to learn from, you're picking from those who have the biggest feathers, right? Those who have the best performance. And that really helps promote not just better kinds of performance on sorting and as fast as possible, actually really complex patterns, and the diffusion of it was dependent on. So norm sort is a very complex, but a really good algorithm for doing sort, and that actually evolved at separate times during it, but it only was sustained in its evolution and passing from participant to participant when you have the selective version of this social learning. And it didn't get sustained, even though it was independently discovered by some people in the random sampling case. So highly recommend taking a look at that paper. I think it's a really neat paper and a really fascinating result. You can also have the effects where your agents have some understanding of what the underlying causal mechanisms or more broadly, just technological reasoning. I kind of like that term that they used in this paper, because causal reasoning, although we focus often on that as a cognitive psychologist, counterfactual reasoning, physical simulation in our minds, all these things are parts of technological reasoning that helps us, that toolkit that allows us to build on and do science and build new things that get better progressively. And how is it that, though, that affects cumulative technological change? Well, they had this task where basically participants would place would be able to manipulate where the weights are. There were 4 different weights on a wheel, and they could manipulate the location of that weight, right? And then they would get if they're like, okay, I'm done, right? And then they would be told how fast that goes in an inclined plane, right? So it turns out that the speed is actually quite complicated because it depends on issues like center of balance, center of mass, and also inertia. And the placements, it's a very nonlinear kind of arrangement, from the positions to the speed. And one of the things that was really neat about this is that they manipulated both what information others were getting, but then also they gave people understanding tests at the end, right? So testing their understanding of basic physics for this particular, in this particular context after they did this study. And if you look at the results, right, so the participants, one of the main contrasts was like, okay, we have our first participant, they do this 5 times. Usually the last 2 times are what's shown to the next participant, right? And it's shown in its full detail. They actually added in noise to, demonstrate, because if you add in noise, even if you're at a good configuration, that often will break the configuration and then make it so it doesn't work well anymore or doesn't work at all. That then means that you can't just do pure copying, right? Because if it ends up not working anymore, then you would just be stuck with, if you're just copying what previous participants did. And then in the speed only, they were told how fast the configurations of the last 2 arrangements were, so their value, right, their fitness, but weren't shown the actual configurations themselves. And what they found was actually, it was surprising to me. I was thought, especially since this was published in Science, I was like, oh man, I bet that they're going to show something like, those who see the configurations with the noise end up doing better in the long run than those who aren't. But actually, that's not what they found. They found that actually, within 5 examples, you can actually learn pretty quick. People are good at this, at figuring out how to, so there was, basically the fitness giving that score alone was enough to get some amount of technological advance, right? You don't actually need to see the configurations for that. And you get both groups find similarly performing solutions. However, if you look at the understanding of participants at each point of the chain, only those who were given the configurations actually developed the understanding of center of mass for this particular context. And that's why it's published in Science, right? So it's a really cool result, and they show this in many different ways, but this is sort of the most brief kind of form of it. Whereas those who had only given the sort of speed only, they developed actually potentially even a better understanding of inertia than those in the other case. But it really was the center of mass understanding that developed quite strongly. And so that's getting to tease at why is it and how is it that technological advances could ever develop? Well, maybe having some sort of causal and counterfactual reasoning, and the theoretical analyses aren't unclear about how that would affect a system. And people have done a little bit of work since the results that I mentioned previously, but it's still an open question how to understand that kind of process from a theoretical perspective too. What factors are responsible, for sort of the human specialness, if you want to go there? And we've seen, in examples that people gave here, that humans aren't special when it comes to the ability to develop a technology and to have cross-cultural transmission of it, right, within generations. We saw that with the birds, especially, which was really beautiful work. And I was kind of blown away by those results. And it's nice having such wonderful videos of those to demonstrate it. So these was a recent review paper. There's actually epigenetical versions of that, which I thought was super neat. I'm not going to try. I'm really bad at biology. I stopped taking it like at 12, so I'm not going to try to explain that. But basically, if you're unfamiliar with epigenetics, it means that like the RNA itself is learning over time. You can show effects of that within generations in between. And there's lots of examples of this. And so this particular review article that came out recently was surveying possible explanations and how human special they really were and the importance of non-genetic inheritance for it and where they were in human specialness. And really, it was kind of interesting because the article really threw out almost all the sort of examples that people had been proposing a decade or two prior based on the sort of results that we saw earlier. And they were sort of arguing that the scope of variation and the way that the sort of variation occurs is just, very different. I threw in some of my own sort of things that I think could be going on here. Abstraction, they talked about this idea of open-endedness. And it was sort of interesting to not see recursion being mentioned and, at all, which is often highlighted, from the Chomsky kind of argument that recursion is something that's special to humans, that our ability to do recursion. We heard about what recursion is from a computer science perspective, but in linguistics, it plays a very strong role. That being said, I'm familiar with some people doing research trying to show that chimps or not chimps, macaque monkeys, I believe, can learn recursive relationships. Using a new paradigm that has been studied in linguistics. Okay. And convergence is a really difficult issue, right? Happy to give you resources for this. In general, like in statistics, there's whole books written about whether Markov Chain Monte Carlo methods have converged or not, right? There's a set of different heuristics people generally use to try and understand it. Chain crossing, so when your chains start to interact that started independently and they start to have the same values over time, the idea is then that you can use martingale type proofs with this, that there's some amount of potentially that they're in the same distributions now, and so you might have reached that stationary distribution, but most of these are heuristics. There's also been some really interesting work, right? The Markov chain Monte Carlo with people, I was just leaving it very open as to how people did the tasks and things like that. You can actually, Markov chain Monte Carlo has been optimized to perform things more efficiently to elicit distributions from, elicit the values from a distribution. And so different things like communication between chains can really help a lot. And that was a really beautiful piece of work from Nuri Jacobi that was at NeurIPS a few years ago. You can include things like the sort of Hamiltonian, if you're familiar with optimization. If not, don't worry about it. And incorporating genetic algorithms and using that then in the framework of Markov chain Monte Carlo with people, or to sample things from and understand the biases of agents that we don't understand, like deep learning networks. This is a technique that's being used to try and understand what kinds of implicit knowledge is learned by these large language models. Okay, so just wanted to thank you all for having me. I'm honored to be part of the group, and for Charlie and Wataru to welcome me here. People for providing some slides and resources. Julia Ying, my undergrad RA, for helping me with that MCMCP study with music. Everyone at Cosmos, especially Group 5, let's go. Yeah, and the Japanese Computing Consortium for some funding. Thanks.